December 3, 2025. Coordinates: 12 degrees north, 130 degrees east. The Philippine Sea. Most of the world ignored the satellite imagery that hit the intelligence desks in Canberra and Washington that morning. To the untrained eye, it was just ships on water, pixels on a screen that looked like any other merchant traffic or routine patrol. But to the strategic planners at the Australian Signals Directorate and the analysts at the Office of National Intelligence, those pixels induced a collective heart attack. The images confirmed the presence of the CNS Hainan, hull number 106. The media calls it a destroyer. Strategic realists call it what it is: a Type 055 high-class cruiser, the most heavily armed surface combatant on the planet. But it wasn't alone. Sailing in its wake was the CNS Hainan, a Type 075 amphibious assault ship carrying 30 helicopters, air cushion landing craft, and 1,000 Marines. They weren't heading north toward the Taiwan Strait to posture against Taipei. They weren't heading east toward Guam to shadow the U.S. 7th Fleet. They were steaming south. For 70 years, the conventional wisdom, the bedrock assumption of Australian defense policy, was that the Southwest Pacific was Australia's backyard. It was an American lake, a sanctuary where Canberra served as the deputy sheriff, ensuring stability in the arc of islands from Timor to Fiji. That assumption died on the morning of December 3rd. This task group represents the first permanent projection of hard Chinese power into the approaches of the Solomon Islands. It is a direct challenge to the red line that Canberra drew only months earlier: no Chinese military bases or permanent naval presence in our sphere of influence. That line wasn't just diplomatic rhetoric, it was a statement of existential necessity. A hostile power in the Solomons sits across the sea lanes that connect Australia to the United States. It creates a chokehold on the Australian economy. China didn't just step over that line. They sailed 40,000 tons of amphibious assault capability right through it. Welcome to Doctrine of War. Today we're dissecting the death of the American lake and the birth of a terrifying new reality in the Pacific. The thesis for today is simple but brutal. Australia is no longer preparing for a hypothetical war in the 2030s. The war for the sea lanes has already begun, and right now Australia is losing. We are going to break down the technical mismatch between the Royal Australian Navy and the plan's expeditionary forces, the uncomfortable reality of the missile gap, and the desperate, late-night diplomacy that is building up Pacific NATO to hold the line. We will look at the $368 billion gamble on nuclear submarines, the emergency purchase of Tomahawk missiles, and the industrial mobilization that is trying to turn a middle power into a porcupine before it's too late. If you want to understand why Canberra is spending more on defense than at any point since the Second World War, you are in the right place. Section 1. The technical and tactical reality. Let's look at the hardware, because geography doesn't care about diplomatic feelings. Geography only respects range, payload, and tonnage. We need to talk about the CNS Hainan. Western media often refers to the Type 055 as a destroyer, to make it sound comparable to US or Australian vessels. This is a classification error that borders on negligence. At 13,000 tons fully loaded, the Type 055 is significantly larger than the US Navy's Ticonderoga-class cruisers. But tonnage is just a number. The terrifying stat is the Vertical Launch System (VLS) cell count. The Hainan carries 112 universal VLS cells. These aren't just tubes. They are the largest VLS cells in the world, capable of hot launching and cold launching missiles that Western ships physically cannot carry. Among its arsenal is the YJ-21 hypersonic anti-ship ballistic missile. This weapon has a terminal velocity of Mach 10 and a range estimated between 1,000 and 1,500 kilometers. Think about what that means. The Hainan can sit outside the radar horizon of an Australian task group and rain down hypersonic warheads that cannot be intercepted by current point defense systems. It is a carrier killer designed to keep the US Navy at arm's length, but against the Royal Australian Navy, it is an apex predator. Sailing alongside it is the CNS Hainan. This isn't just a troop transport. It is a floating forward operating base. It allows the PLA to project air power and land troops on island chains without needing a concrete runway. It carries Z-8 heavy transport helicopters and potentially naval variants of armed attack helicopters. It turns a presence mission into an occupation capability. Now, compare this to what Australia had in the water to intercept them. The Hobart-class destroyers, HMS Hobart, Brisbane, and Sydney, are excellent ships. They are equipped with the Aegis Combat System, the gold standard of naval warfare. But they displace only 7,000 tons. Crucially, they carry only 48 VLS cells. Do the math. In a kinetic exchange, A single Type 055 can fire a saturation strike of 60 anti-ship missiles and still have 50 cells left over for air defense. An Australian destroyer firing everything it has can only launch 48 missiles total. The Hainan outsticks and outguns the Hobart by a factor of more than 2 to 1. This isn't about showing the flag or freedom of navigation. This is about a fundamental overmatch in throw weight. But the crossing wasn't just naval. It was violent. We need to talk about the flare incident of October 2025. This event was underreported in the mainstream press, but in military circles, it was viewed as a kinetic attack. An Australian P-8A Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft was conducting routine surveillance in international airspace north of the Solomons. It was intercepted by a Chinese J-16 fighter jet. This wasn't a standard intercept where the pilot waves and flies alongside. The J-16 cut directly across the nose of the P-8 at close range and released a bundle of chaff. For those who don't know, chaff consists of thousands of tiny strips of aluminum and zinc, designed to confuse radar-guided missiles. But when you dump a cloud of aluminum strips into the intake of a high-bypass turbofan engine, it acts like a shotgun blast. It shreds the turbine blades. The Australian pilot was forced to shut down the number 1 engine and abort the mission, limping back to base on a single engine. This wasn't a warning. This was a deliberate attempt to degrade an Australian asset without firing a missile. It relies on the gray zone, the ambiguity between peace and war. China's message was clear: you do not own the sky above the Solomons anymore. If you fly here, we will bring you down. And this leads us to the terrifying strategic question. If China establishes a rotating presence of Type 055s and Type 075s in the Solomons, operating under the cover of land-based anti-air missiles, they can sever the supply lines between Brisbane and Pearl Harbor. 90% of Australia's liquid fuel comes via sea tanker. Australia has roughly 30 days of fuel reserves on the continent. If a Chinese task group in the Solomons decides to harass, board, or sink merchant tankers heading for Botany Bay, Australia's economy grinds to a halt in a month. They don't need to invade Sydney. They just need to choke the sea lanes. Mid-roll call to action. If you're starting to grasp why a few ships in the Solomons represents a strategic chokehold on an entire continent, hit that like button and subscribe to Doctrine of War. We're breaking down the defense partnerships reshaping global power, from the shipyards of Adelaide to the boardrooms of Tokyo, and your support keeps this analysis coming. Part 2, the response. Here is where the reality gets complicated. Australia has drawn a red line, but does it have the capacity to enforce it? The uncomfortable reality is the tyranny of distance and the gap of time. Australia has bet its future on the AUKUS nuclear submarines. The $368 billion deal to acquire nuclear-powered attack submarines, SSNs, is the largest defense project in the nation's history. And let's be clear, SSNs are the correct strategic choice. Unlike conventional diesel-electric boats that have to snorkel to recharge batteries, making them vulnerable to radar and satellite detection, a nuclear submarine can stay submerged indefinitely. It can sprint from Perth to the South China Sea at 30 knots, stay on station for 3 months, and return without ever breaking the surface. It is the ultimate deterrent. But there is a problem. The first SSN AUKUS won't be in the water until the late 2030s. The interim capability, the transfer of Virginia-class submarines from the United States, is still years away, slated for the early 2030s. The crisis is happening now. In December 2025. Right now, the Royal Australian Navy relies on 6 Collins-class submarines. These were groundbreaking boats in the 1990s, but they are aging. They suffer from propulsion issues, and despite heroic efforts to extend their life of type, they are diesel-electric boats in an age of persistent surveillance. In a high-intensity conflict against the plan's anti-submarine warfare network, their survivability is questionable. This creates the Valley of Death, a decade-long capability gap where the old fleet is retiring and the new fleet hasn't arrived. And China knows this. They know that between 2025 and 2035, Australia is vulnerable. That is why they are pushing into the Solomons now. They are creating a fait accompli before the nuclear boats arrive. So, what does Canberra do when the enemy is at the gates and the cavalry is a decade away? They have to improvise. This is why you are seeing the sudden, frantic acceleration of the Ghost Shark program. The Ghost Shark is an extra-large autonomous underwater vehicle, XLAUV. Think of it as a submarine drone the size of a school bus. Developed in partnership with Endural Industries, this isn't just a science experiment. It is a desperate bid for mass. The Ghost Shark doesn't need a crew. It doesn't need food, sleep, or oxygen. It can dive to 6,000 meters, depths that would crush a manned submarine. It has an endurance of 10 days or more without surfacing. But its real value is attrition economics. Australia cannot afford to trade manned submarines with China. The plan has dozens of hulls, the RAN has 6. If Australia loses a Collins-class boat with 60 sailors on board, it's a national tragedy and a strategic catastrophe that creates a political crisis. If China loses a drone, it's a Tuesday. The Ghost Shark allows Australia to contest the sea without risking Australian lives. It can sit on the seabed of the strategic approaches for weeks, listening for the acoustic signature of a Chinese submarine. It can act as a mobile minefield. It forces the Chinese Navy to spend precious resources hunting cheap drones instead of hunting high-value targets. It is the asymmetrical answer to the mass of the plan. But drones aren't enough. You need hard kill capability. You need to be able to sink the Hainan. That's why we're seeing the emergency purchase of Block V Tomahawk missiles. Specifically the Maritime Strike Tomahawk, MST, variant. For decades, the Tomahawk was a land attack weapon. You used it to hit bunkers in Baghdad. But the Block VA MST has a new seeker head that allows it to hit moving targets at sea. With a range in excess of 1,600 kilometers, these missiles change the geometry of the battlefield. Previously, an Australian destroyer had to get within 200 kilometers to fire a Harpoon missile, suicide range against the Type 055. Now, with the Tomahawk MST, the Australian Navy can strike targets in the Solomons from the relative safety of the Coral Sea. It changes the Australian Defence Force from a defence force into a strike force. But again, we have to ask the uncomfortable question. Is it enough? The US Navy has thousands of Tomahawks. Australia has ordered a few hundred. In a high-intensity war where interception rates are high, you might need to fire 20 missiles to guarantee one hit on a cruiser with advanced defenses. A stockpile of 200 missiles might last 3 days of combat. Then what? This brings us to the industrial nightmare. The Henderson Shipyard in Western Australia and the Osborne Naval Shipyard in South Australia are being expanded, but shipyards don't appear overnight. You need welders, nuclear engineers, and systems integrators. The AUKUS deal requires a workforce that Australia currently does not possess. We are seeing a scramble to train thousands of workers, but you cannot train a nuclear-certified welder in 6 months. The industrial base is the Achilles heel of the entire strategy. This brings us to the masterstroke, the geopolitical pivot that changes the math entirely. If Australia cannot win the tonnage war alone, it must change the alliance architecture. On December 7, 2025, in a meeting room in Tokyo that will be written about in history books, the Australian Deputy Prime Minister and the Japanese Minister of Defense signed the Framework for Strategic Defense Coordination. Strip away the diplomatic language. This is Australia playing the Japan card. For 70 years, the Pacific security architecture was a hub-and-spokes model. The US was the hub. Japan, Australia, and Korea were the spokes. They talked to Washington, but they rarely talked to each other. That model is dead. This new framework effectively merges the strategic depth of Australia with the industrial and naval mass of Japan. It allows the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, JMSDF, arguably the second most capable navy in the Pacific, to operate seamlessly with the RAN. Think about the geography. Japan blocks the northern exit of the first island chain. Australia blocks the southern exit. By coordinating their defense, they trap the Chinese Navy inside the chain. The agreement allows Australian F-35s and strike bombers to potentially operate from Japanese bases, extending their reach into the East China Sea. Conversely, it allows Japanese destroyers, like the Mogami-class frigates and the converted Izumo-class aircraft carriers, to replenish and rearm in Darwin. This creates a Pacific NATO in all but name. It complicates China's targeting cycle. Now, if the plan moves on the Solomons, they aren't just facing an isolated Australia. They are facing a coordinated pincers from the north, Japan, and the south, Australia, all backed by US intelligence. This is a force multiplier. It turns the first island chain and the second island chain into a unified operational theater. It signals to Beijing that crossing the red line doesn't just annoy Canberra. It triggers a collective defense response from the two most powerful maritime democracies in the region. And we cannot forget the United States. While US carriers are distant, the US Air Force is moving in. The expansion of RAAF Base Tyndall in the Northern Territory is critical. The US is building aprons and bunkers capable of hosting B-52 Stratofortresses and B-21 Raiders. Tyndall is becoming the unsinkable aircraft carrier south of the Chinese missile envelope. From Tyndall, US bombers can reach the South China Sea, drop their payloads and return, all while being outside the range of most Chinese tactical missiles. Australia has woken up from the holiday of history. The red line in the Pacific is not a rhetorical device. It is a line drawn in the water, backed by autonomous drones, long-range missiles, and a new ironclad alliance with Tokyo. But lines on a map are meaningless unless you are willing to defend them. The flare incident was the test. The task group in the Solomons is the challenge. The response, Ghost Sharks, Tomahawks, and the Japan Pact, is the bet. Australia is betting $368 billion that it can build a porcupine fast enough to make the dragon hesitate. It is betting that a sovereign industrial base can be built from scratch before the shooting starts. But as we look at the satellite imagery of the Hainan steaming south, watching its radar spin and its missile hatches wait, we have to ask the hard question. Is hesitation enough? Or are we watching the slow-motion beginning of a blockade that will strangle the Australian economy? Hope is not a strategy. Buying time is not a victory. And right now Australia is running out of both. Thanks for watching Doctrine of War. Do you think the Ghost Shark drones are enough to deter the plan, or is Australia's submarine gap a fatal flaw? Let me know in the comments below. Stay sharp, stay realistic, and we'll see you in the next one.